Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org. Idaho Matters is taking a deep dive into the loss of farmland here in the Gem State. Are you a farmer? What challenges do you face as farmland shrinks in Idaho? We want to hear your story. Email us at idahomatters@boisestate.edu or leave us a voicemail using the Talk to Us feature in the Boise State Public Radio app. And then listen to our series on farming called Land and Legacy. Episodes available on Monday afternoons in the Idaho Matters podcast feed. More Idaho Matters now from the studios of Boise State Public Radio News. I'm Gemma Gaudette. Debate over the death penalty has intensified recently, both nationally and here in Idaho. When President Donald Trump came back into office in January, he issued an executive order on restoring the death penalty. While in Idaho, last year officials tried and failed to execute death row prisoner Thomas Creech, and when they couldn't find a vein to give him a lethal dose of drugs, and the Department of Correction is now working on a system to begin using a firing squad as a form of execution. Death penalty expert Corinna Lain will be in Boise this Friday. She is the S.D. Roberts and Sandra Moore Professor of Law at the University of Richmond School of Law, and she has a new book, Secrets of the Killing State, The Untold Story of Lethal Injection. And she's joining us now to talk more. Corinna, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Gemma.
So why did you want to write this book in particular?
Oh, that's a great question. I'm a death penalty scholar, and I've been writing and researching the death penalty for about 18 years. And I just had a research question. That's what started it. And it was, why are states so bad at lethal injection? You know, we know how to put down our pets. We know how physician-assisted suicide works. You know, we put people under anesthesia every single day, cut open their chests and do all kinds of painful things. So why are states so very bad at lethal injection? And, that was what actually started it. I can tell you that as I got into that project, it was clear to me that it was a book. And I didn't want to write a book, so I set it down. And there's a whole faith story. I will go to my grave saying I was called to write this book, but that's how it started.
You say that there is quite a bit of fake science involved in lethal injection, and we hear about these botched injections, but you say there's a lot more that we don't hear about. Can you talk about that?
Sure. I mean, botched executions are what drew my attention. Those are what draws the public's attention, but they're truly the tip of the iceberg. They are the torturous deaths that we see. But under the surface, there are torturous deaths, numerous torturous deaths that we don't see. And so one of the things that I didn't know and found interesting is that the 3-drug protocol that states used for 35 to 40 years uses a paralytic that is also a muscle relaxant. And so it relaxes the muscles in the person's face and then it freezes them that way. And so you're going to get this nice drifting off to sleep look regardless of what is happening. And then what a study of over 200 execution autopsies by lethal injection in 2020 found was that 84% of those autopsies are showing acute pulmonary edema. So lungs that are heavy with fluid. As one federal court in Ohio stated, we're essentially waterboarding people to death. And that's, of course, not including all of the other problems with lethal injection, like what we saw with Mr. Creech, where, he is an elderly gentleman. He's now 74 years old. And, in February 2024, executioners tried 8 different locations to get access to his veins and just couldn't. And so there's all sorts of problems that we don't see.
I want to talk a little bit more about this botched execution of Thomas Creech, as you mentioned, because this made national headlines.
Mhm.
And I think it really reinvigorated the conversation around lethal injection. Because as you said, they could not find a vein to give him drugs. Uh, and this is such a hard thing during lethal injections is to find a vein. Yet they have to find veins all the time in hospitals. Now, granted, I've had a couple of times where they've had a hard time finding a vein. My one of my kiddos just had a minor surgery a couple of months ago, and it took them quite a while to find a vein. So why is this so difficult? And I guess we just assume, oh, you just get a needle, find a vein, and 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 the process begins, and it's easy.
Yeah. And, that was one of the questions that drew me to this project. I was seeing autopsies with 18 puncture wounds in them. I was seeing autopsies with 14 puncture wounds. I saw an autopsy that had tan-colored makeup covering puncture wounds in the neck, where executioners had actually tried to insert a catheter in the prisoner's neck. And so, this is a question, and it goes against, as you say, our instinctive, well, people do that all the time. What is so hard about lethal injection? Well, I will tell you, Gemma, it takes pages upon pages for a full explanation, but I think we
Hmm.
could start with the fact that these are aging, ailing prisoners. So, for example, Thomas Creech has been on death row for 50 years, and there is a natural disintegration and weakening of the veins that happens, just like the rest of our bodies get older. The veins also get older and more delicate. Aside from that, most of the people on death row have lived what can only be described as unhealthy lifestyles. Many of them are former IV users, or IV drug users. And so, there's all of these problems. And as I was studying lethal injection, I thought, you know, knowing what I know now, my job is not to tell states how to kill, of course, but I thought, the idea of injecting a massive overdose of drugs into a population that has notoriously weak veins is just really, I don't know, unthoughtful, I should say. And interestingly, there was a report in 1890 where states were looking for an alternative to hanging. They ended up coming up with the electric chair in that report, but they considered death by drugs. So they considered what we call a lethal injection. And they studied it and they recommended against it. And one of the
Hmm.
reasons was what they called, quote, anatomical difficulties. They knew back in 1890 this was a really stupid, bad idea. Thinking about who these people are, what is a geriatric, poor health population. And yet somehow we forgot that and adopted it in 1977, not paying attention to any of that at all. So here we are.
You know what's interesting is it seems to me that lethal injection um, started for 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 the death penalty to be more humane, right? And I think that when the average person thinks about it, there's an assumption that lethal injection is more humane than, let's say, hanging the electric chair. I mean, here in Idaho, they're bringing back the
Mhm.
firing squad, right? So is that just a myth? And at the same time, though, I think that there are people that would say, who cares if this is humane or not?
Yeah. So, first of all, it is a myth. I'm also a legal historian. And so, one of the things I talk about in the book is I get into the legal history, the legislative debates around lethal injection. And yes, it's true that there were some legislators that were talking about a more humane death. Um, It's worth noting that they were talking about that based on nothing at all. I also track how lethal injection was actually invented off of the top of a guy's head, who referred to himself as an expert in dead bodies, but not in how to get them that way. He literally said, I
Hmm.
did no research. So, aside from that, one of the things that was super interesting in getting into the legal history was, yes, there were conversations about this being a humane execution method, but a striking thread that was present in many, and in fact, most of these debates, was not a concern for a humane execution, but rather a concern for a humane looking execution.
Hmm.
And one of the things that people miss is that at the time, a federal court had actually recognized a First Amendment right to televise executions. And so I actually quote legislators saying, oh, we can't have an electrocution in someone's living room. They were very, very worried about the appearance of executions. And in 1977, when lethal injection was invented, the country had not seen an execution in 10 years. So it had been a whole decade, and legislators were really worried that the country would be squeamish about that sort of state violence. So, that's as to that point. The other point I think is a really good one. Why should we care? And let's go back to Thomas Creech, because I have to tell you, I'm super excited to come to Idaho, and I teach a death penalty class. I'm a death penalty scholar, and Creech versus Arave is a case that I have taught in my death penalty class. It's a Supreme Court
Hmm.
case for 15 years now. And, I always said, I'm a former prosecutor, by the way. I always said, well, Thomas Creech, I mean, he's this serial killer. He was sentenced to death for 5 murders, but I think he confessed to
Hmm.
24 others. He's what about Thomas Creech? Like, if anybody is a poster child for the death penalty, it's Thomas Creech. Well, fast forward to where we are now, and he is known as this kind-hearted man. He writes poetry. He wrote a poem for the judge that sentenced him to death. And by the way, that very judge is now against his execution. A former warden is against his execution.
I'm going to need to cut
Inside.
you off there. I'm so sorry. We are out of time. We've been talking with death penalty expert Corinna Lain. She will be in Boise this Friday at Rediscovered Books. This is the Idaho Matters podcast. I'm Gemma Gaudette.
Sources and methods, the crown jewels of the intelligence community. Shorthand for how do we know what's real? Who told us? If you have those answers, you're on the inside, and NPR wants to bring you there. From the Pentagon to the State Department to spy agencies, listen to understand what's really happening and what it means for you. Sources and Methods, the new national security podcast from NPR.